Hagaddah today. We'll look over the Hagaddah today. All right, the Hagaddah starts, of course, you have Kiddush, but then you have the Lachma Anya. The Lachma Anya, this is the poor man's bread that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Kol dichvin yesav yechol, whoever is hungry, let him come in and eat. Kol ditzrich, whoever needs to, yesav yiftach, let him join us for the Pesach. Now, some explain for the Pesach, meaning for the carbon Pesach, for the Pesach sacrifice. Obviously, today we don't give up carbon Pesach, but in when we had the Beis Hamikdash, we would give a carbon Pesach. And so, Kol Ditzrich Yesev Yiftach, whoever has the requirement of giving the carbon Pesach should come and join. But some explain Kol Ditzrich Yesev Yiftach, whoever has a need to join us for Pesach. In other words, he doesn't have the ability to have a Pesach meal, to have the Seder himself. So let him join us for Pesach. Now, the question is, there seems to be a redundancy here. On one hand, we say, Kol dichvin yesav yechol, whoever is hungry, let him come in and eat. On the other hand, he says, Kol ditzrich, whoever is in need, yesav yiftach, let him come in and join in the Pesach sacrifice. Hashat Tahacha, L'Shana Haba Bar Yisrael. Today we're here. Next year we'll be in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. Hashat Ta'avdei. Now we are servants, slaves. We're not free. L'Shana Haba B'nei Chorei. Next year we'll be free. Okay, so the question is, first of all, what's the significance of all this at the beginning of the Pesach Seder? Why is it mentioned? And then, as I mentioned, the redundancy. And now the halach. So the kol dichvin yesav yechol. So the Brisker Rav says, and they say in the name of the Brisker Rav, at least I heard in the name of the Brisker Rav, that the after all, today there is no carbon Pesach, there's no Pesach sacrifice. So when we say Kol Ditzrich Yesev Yiftach, so we're in a sense next year. It's talking about next year. In a sense, the Brisker Rav doesn't put it in these words, but in a sense, we could say the idea is that we are issuing two invitations. We're issuing an invitation for this year, and this year is Kol Dichvin Yesav Yechol. Whoever is hungry, let him come and join us. There is no carbon Pesach this year, but we're also inviting the Jews for next year. So for next year, Kol Ditzrich, whoever will need, let him come and partake of the carbon Pesach. Hashat Tahacha, right now we can only invite you to eat. We can't invite you to carbon Pesach because we're here. We're still Avadim. We don't have the Beis Hamikdash yet. But next year we'll be in Eretz Yisrael. Next year we'll have the Beis Hamikdash. Next year we'll be free. Next year we'll be able to have a carbon Pesach. So we're offering an invitation both for the present time and for the future. My impression is that some of this is based on what that I heard in the name of the Brisker Rav, and to a certain degree what I heard in the name of my uncle. But but these are the two separate invitations. And what's the idea behind it? I think I heard this in the name of my uncle. The idea behind it is that the Hagaddah for the Jew of Golus offers a special blueprint for the future Gula. In other words, we learn from that just as God redeemed us at that time, we draw inspiration and look forward to the new Gula, to the Gula when Mashiach will come and when we return to Eretz Yisrael and when the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt. So Kol Dichvan Yes V'Echol, that's now. But next year, when we'll be free, we're inviting people in to join us for the Pesach sacrifice. Now, and in a sense, and I think that and the Rambam starts off the Hagaddah. We don't have it in our Hagaddah. B'vihilu yatzu Yisrael Mitzrayim. In a rush did the Jewish people go out of Egypt. And the idea is that just as the Gula took place very suddenly, that Gula took place very suddenly, the future Gula could also take place very suddenly. So we have to look forward to the possibility of Mashiach coming very soon. And that enables us enables us and inspires us to invite people for the Seder next year when we will have the Korban Pesach, when we'll have the Pesach sacrifice. And I think my uncle said, in other words, and when we say Matzazu Shanu Ochlim al Shema, when we say, why do we eat this matzah? So we say because the Jewish people went out in a rush. They didn't have time. They didn't have time even to let the dough rise. Until God revealed himself to them, and he redeemed them. And the Rambam adds a word we don't have in our God, the miyad. He redeemed them right away. So we can draw inspiration from that to the idea that the Geula will take place very soon. And it's interesting that also we say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chishev in the Hagaddah, we say HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chishev as a case. God used some type of some type of mathematics, so to say, because the Jews were supposed to be slaves in Egypt for 400 years, and they were redeemed after 200 some odd years. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chishev as a case. He evaluated on the basis of the time from the birth of Yitzchak. So, but the Rambam, there was one text of the Rambam, Mechashev as a case, Kamo Shomar Avraham Avinu, that God is now evaluating the case. In other words, God is looking for methods, depending on the way we act, looking for methods to make the golas, to make the exile shorter. And to draw and we can draw inspiration because that's what happened in Mitzrayim in Egypt. Now, and we could suggest that I was asked a question by Reb David Meshalov from Eretz Yisrael. That was the question he mentioned to me. That from the Rambam, it appears, actually it's the Mishnah, that we should and when we say the Parsha Bikurim, so we should mention that the Rambam says the Parsha Kula, and the Mishnah says Parsha Kula. So why is it that in the Hagaddah we do not discuss the whole Parsha? We should say the drashos of the whole parsha. Now, my uncle in the Hagaddah that was put out by his grandson, Rav Yitzchak Lichtenstein. So in parentheses, it's mentioned, I assume that was from my uncle, that as when it says Haparsha Kula, it has reference to the aspects of the parsha that deal with Yetzias Mitzrayim. And we could understand that deal with Yetzias Mitzrayim. And we could add a point, and we could suggest that Ein Hachinami, that when Mashiach comes, and the Jewish people will be returned to Eretz Yisrael, and they will bring Bikurim. They will bring Bikurim, so perhaps we will say the whole parsha. In regard to the parts about Yetzias Mitzrayim, there's a halacha chayav adam liros esatzmo kilu yotza atam yeshiva Mitzrayim. We have to see ourselves as if it was taking place right now, Yetzias Mitzrayim. But that doesn't apply to the Jewish people entering Eretz Yisrael. That only apply. It's true. The Jewish people entered Eretz Yisrael in the time of Yeshua, and after the 14 years of Kibush v'Chiluk, they became chayav. They became required in Bikurim. But there is no halacha of chayav adam liros esatzmo to see himself as he went out of Egypt at that point. And this is a halacha of hodah, of giving thanks to God. So we give thanks to God to that which we are experiencing. Yetzias Mitzrayim, the leaving Egypt, when we experience it, we experience the Exodus from Egypt. So we give thanks to God. But today we're not situated in Eretz Yisrael in the manner that we would be required to give Bikurim. So since we're not situated in Eretz Yisrael in the manner we're not required to give Bikurim, we can't give thanks to God over that. We only give thanks to God. We only give thanks to God for that which we are experiencing now. There's a difference between thanks and praise. Thanks has to be given at the time that we're experiencing something, when we get something. Praise, that could be even later. So we do not have the Parsha Bikurim that talks about the Jewish people entering Eretz Yisrael and being in Eretz Yisrael. And today, even though there are multitudes of Jews that live in Eretz Yisrael, but there is no mitzvah. There is no mitzvah bikurim. Our settling in Eretz Yisrael is not of such nature that there is a mitzvah bikurim. Consequently, there is no halacha of giving thanks. Now, it's true. The Rambam says in the Arach HaZokas, HaParsha Kula, that you have to say drashos on the whole parsha of Bikurim. But in the Nusach Hagaddah, the Rambam doesn't say, the Rambam doesn't say that the whole parsha. Why is it that way? So we could say, even if we don't accept what my uncle says, we could say, the Rambam says at the beginning of the Hagaddah, he says that this is the Hagaddah that the Jews say during the time of Golus. So when it's possible that when we will have the mitzvah of Bikurim, so we will read the whole parsha and say the drashos on the whole parsha. Until that time, Pesach at night, we only say drashos on Yetzias Mitzrayim because we're not able to experience, and it's more than just that, because part of the idea of Pesach at night is, in a sense, to look forward to the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash. In a sense, now we talk about looking forward to the coming of Mashiach. We look forward to the coming of Beis Hamikdash. We constantly say, both here and in the Hagaddah, and very often in other places also, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, we're looking forward to Mashiach coming very soon. But it's not the only way to really look forward to the coming of Mashiach. Is the only way to look forward to the coming of Mashiach is to sense the lack of being in Eretz Yisrael now. the sense of not having the Beis Hamikdash. So, on the contrary, it could be that the reason the Hagaddah left it out is because, in a sense, we should feel there's something missing. And when we feel that there's something missing, we look forward to getting it. My father mentioned to me that the Netziv, when on the Shlosha Regalim, so he used to, in the middle of the Musaf Shmoneh Esrei, apparently he was the Chazan, and when he would talk about being, when the Tfilos would talk about being in the Beis HaMikdash, so he would cry with the expression my father said in the name of his father, that there were so many tears. It might have been just an expression, I don't know. But the Netziv cried so much during the Shlosha Regalim, during the Musaf, that the floor was so wet that it was dangerous to walk there. A person could slip. I assumed that was just an expression. But when it came Rosh Hashanah, Yom HaKippurim, when he said the Musaf, it was with a very happy expression. And my father was troubled. Why? Rosh Hashanah, Yom HaKippurim, these are times that Jews cry. And then it's during the Musaf Shmoneh Esrei, when he made reference to the Beis HaMikdash, when it was with joy and happiness. But in the Shlosha Regalim, there it was he was crying so much. Why is it? And I think that we could suggest, because when it came to the Shlosha Regalim, all the Jews would come up to the Beis HaMikdash. And in a sense, because of that, there was something missing, because we were in Golus. Because he remembered being in the Beis HaMikdash. That's why the Netziv cried during the Shlosha Regalim, because he thought about where we should be right now. So I think this perhaps it's important on the contrary. And we see after the Hagaddah, of course, this was instituted later, it was a minhag. You burn a Beis HaMikdash. We talk about the Beis HaMikdash being rebuilt, because now we sense that loss, the inability to give the Karban Pesach. So we look forward to the Beis HaMikdash being rebuilt, and that we could give the Karban Pesach and do the Avodah again. And then there is another possibility we could say, and that possibility is that if you take a look through the Toseftas and the Hagaddah, and there seems to be a contrast. Whether there is a mitzvah, and the Rambam, if there is a mitzvah to speak about the halachas of Pesach, the Rambam really doesn't mention the mitzvah of speaking, only giving the tamim for the mitzvah of Pesach, al shema, al shumma, giving the reason for the mitzvahs, but the Rambam does not focus at all on the idea of learning the laws of Pesach at the Seder. By the Ben Chacham, even when he talks in the Nusach Hagaddah, so you have to tell him the halachas up to it, according to the Gra, according to the Vilna Gaon. You learn the Mishnayos of Psachim with him. Up to the very end of Psachim there, the last two Mishnahs of Eimaftirin Achar Pesach Hafikomen. You learn the Mishnayos, and the Tosefta talks about if you have a group of Chachamim, so they should learn Hilchos Pesach, and in the Rambam there's almost no mention of that. So, but it seems that it's possible that there was a difference in the earlier years. There wasn't no book of the Hagaddah per se that we have today. You see, there's a machlokes, Rav and Shmuel, what should be said. And everything was based on the individual. You see, Ben Chacham has one approach. Ben Rosh, okay, there's a question of whether we answer them all together. Tom Sheni Odei Lishlo. So it's very possible that instead of having a text of a Hagaddah which was composed later on, there was a halacha of learning, whether it was the Mechilta or learning the Sifri and learning the Mishnayos. Depending on the individual, they would discuss Hilchos Pesach, but as learning, not as part of the Hagaddah per se. And that varied from case to case. Of course, there were things that they had to say. But ultimately, as the Jewish people went to Golus, and that's perhaps why the Rambam emphasizes at the beginning of the Hagaddah, that this is the Hagaddah, the Nusach of the Hagaddah, that the Jewish people say in Golus, it came necessary to have one text, like we find in regard to Tfilos and Brachos, that by the Modin de Rabbanan, that there were different minhagim, how it should be composed. So it was necessary to have one text. So when the Parsha Bikurim was said, and it was said from learning it from the Torah, rather than being as part of the Hagaddah, so it could be that at that time they would that they learned the whole parsha, and they said the drashos that are on the whole parsha. But once the text was made for everybody, they had to compose a text that would fit for most of the people. So consequently, the changes that took place. So in the Nusach Hagaddah, the Rambam doesn't mention the whole parsha or the drashos that are said in the whole parsha. And he focuses only on Yetzias Mitzrayim, whereas in the halachos he says, in accordance with the expression of the Mishnah, as a parsha kula, the whole parsha of Bikurim. So that's how we could answer it. But I think that perhaps, and this is all part that I think we could understand that kol dichven yesev yiftach, and I know there are some Rishonim that explain kol ditzrich yesev yiftach doesn't have reference to the Karban Pesach, doesn't necessarily have reference to the future, but it's talking about this time. But kol ditzrich, whoever needs, let it come and join us for Pesach, has reference to the Pesach necessities of right now, not just the Karban Pesach, the matzah, the maror, the meal. So we're inviting them in for the meal now. So why do we need the redundancy? Kol dichven yesev b'yechol, whoever is hungry, let him come in and eat. Kol ditzrich yesev yiftach, whoever is in need, let him come and join us. The answer is there are two requirements why we have to supply those who need on Pesach. There is the general mitzvah of tzedakah. There is a general mitzvah every day of the year that when someone is hungry, we have to be able to feed him. And then there's a special mitzvah on Pesach. The Gra says that Moas Chitim is based on the matzos ye'ochel. It's not enough. It's not just that there's a mitzvah of eating matzah. We have to make sure that matzos are eaten. Why is it that way? So you could say, I think my uncle says that my uncle mentions about that why we start off. He doesn't, not in regard to that, but he says because Cheres is inviting somebody into the house, and the Eved can't invite somebody in. I think we could add another thing, because there are two psukim that we learn of Chayav Adam Liros Esatzmo Kilu Yotza Me'eretz Mitzrayim. One pasuk talks about the individual. You shall tell your children, this is what God, because of this, God took me out of Egypt. I am going out of Egypt now. I am experiencing the redemption. But then there's another pasuk. Not just as our ancestors God take, Afo Sonu in the plural form, us also, Imohem, we went out with them. It's not enough for us as individuals to feel free, to see ourselves going out of Egypt, to act as somebody who was just redeemed. We have to make sure that that Klal Yisrael is able to see itself, that the Jewish people are able to see itself as being redeemed. And that imposes an obligation on us to let others, in a sense, celebrate, enable them to celebrate Pesach with us. So that's the reason we say, Kol Ditzrich Yesef Yiftach. But nevertheless, there's a general mitzvah, a Kol Dichven Yesef Yechol. Why do we mention that now? Now, the Gemara in Tainis, Daf Chaf, mentions that Rav Nachman, Rav Huna, that Rav Huna used to, in every time he ate, he would, when he had a meal, he would say, Kol dichven yeseh b'yechol. Whoever is hungry, let him come in and eat. We mention it only on Pesach night. Now, it speaks apparently from the fact that the Gemara identifies it, uses the same expression that the Gemara in Tainis uses in regard to Rav Huna, the same idea. It seems that it's not talking specifically about Pesach night. It's talking about every night of the year. So why is it that we mention it specifically in the Hagaddah when we start the Hagaddah? Now, there is this question, famous question, that there is almost no reference, one reference to Moshe Rabbeinu in the Hagaddah. And there's almost no reference to Moshe Rabbeinu in the Hagaddah. So the famous answer everybody gives in one form or another is because we say in the Hagaddah, Ani v'lo malach, ani v'lo hashliach, that the redemption from Egypt took place by God Himself. Ani v'lo malach, ani v'lo hashliach. We have to emphasize that it was God who took us out of Egypt. There is a problem, because the Rambam says that when you talk to the Ben Chacham, you have to tell him the nisim that were done through Moshe Rabbeinu. So again, the answer could be, when you talk to the Ben Chacham understands. But the Hagaddah wasn't just written, as I mentioned before, it wasn't just written for the Ben Chacham. The Hagaddah was written for the Hamonam. And since the Hagaddah was written for the Hamonam, so in a sense, we have to take extra precaution and to emphasize that it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu who took us out of Egypt. The Ben Chacham could understand, even if you mention that Moshe Rabbeinu was the Shliach, that it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu that took us out of Egypt. But not all Klal Yisrael are, unfortunately, are Chachamim. Consequently, the Hagaddah didn't emphasize, and today there is a general text. That's the Hagaddah. But I think that we could give another answer. Now, in Parshas Tetzaveh, the Baal HaTorah asked the question, why is it that Moshe Rabbeinu's name is not mentioned in Parshas Tetzaveh? And it's quite obvious because Parshas Tetzaveh talks about Aaron being, even though the Baal Term gives a different answer, Aaron becoming the Kohen Gadol. So we emphasize Aaron, and so even though there's references to Moshe, Moshe's name is not mentioned because we're emphasizing the role of Aaron as the Kohen Gadol in Parshas Tetzaveh. Now, the question is, what is the celebration? What is the celebration of the Hagaddah, the celebration of Pesach night? When you take a look at the Hagaddah, who is mentioned more than anybody else? I'm not talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was the ultimate, he's the one that redeemed us. But I think the Hagaddah focuses on the Avos, and more than the Avos, more than anybody else, it focuses on Avraham Avinu. Baruch Shomer Haftachasa Yisrael. Blessed is God. It's a celebration of recognition of God, admitting that God fulfilled his commitment to the Avos, just as the Parsha Bikurim is, in a sense, talks about the Avos to a certain degree, the beginning with the Avos, but Baruch Shomer Avtachas Yisrael, for the main part, the Hagaddah itself is a celebration of God, of recognizing that God fulfilled his commitment to Avraham Avinu. And we find that the Medrash tells us, Rashi quotes it, that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe to tell the Jewish people to take, Gemara in Brachos mentions it also, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe to take the Jewish people to take from Egypt, Kleis Chesed, Kleis Zav, Usmolos, and everything, to in a sense, loot Egypt. They were entitled to it because of the labor that they did there, for sure. But so he said, I don't want that Osot Tzaddik, that Avraham Avinu should say, but Vodum Vinu Osam, he fulfilled. He didn't fulfill, that he didn't fulfill the mitzvah of letting them go out with wealth. In other words, to a certain degree, the idea behind Yetzias Mitzrayim was the fulfillment of the commitment that was given to Avraham Avinu. So if I was to select who the Hagaddah centers around, of course it centers around HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but in terms of a person, it centers around Avraham Avinu. It centers around the Avos, and it's very interesting that the Zohar says that the Pesach is the holiday of Avraham Avinu. Shavuos is the holiday of Yitzchak, and Sukkot is the holiday of Yaakov. I would suggest that the reason Pesach is the holiday of Avraham because it's Goy Mikarev Goy. It's the separating Avraham, separation of the Jewish people from Egypt and from the nations of the world. They become their own nation. And Avraham, Echad Haya Avraham Avinu, Avraham separated himself. And it's very interesting, at the very end of the Hagaddah, Ger Tzedek Hitzachta, you made the Ger Tzedek Avraham victorious. Refers to Avraham as the Ger Tzedek. Pesach, in a sense, is the holiday of Geras. As a matter of fact, Rashi says that there was a habit. I would have thought, if not for a special Zeres HaKosuv, that every ger should give a carbon Pesach when he undergoes gerus. Why? Because Pesach is the holiday of separating ourselves from the Umos Olam, from the nations of the world. And Avraham, certainly according to the Dasken and Baal Tosfos, he was a ger. And even though the Brisker Rav says that you can't say that Avraham was a ger, because a ger is an immigrant, someone who joined something. And Avraham was the foundation of the Jewish people. But nevertheless, the word ger comes from the word gar-ger. My father would always mention that the Rishonim say that the word ger, a seed is something that doesn't have roots. Every ger is a ger for two reasons. First of all, he's a ger because he cut himself off from the other nations of the world. And secondly, he's a ger because he joined the Jewish people. Avraham, we could say, even according to the Brisker Rav, he wasn't the ger in joining the Jewish people because he was the foundation of the Jewish people. Rishon Legerim, that the Gemara says in Chagiga, that means that they undergo bris milah. He was the first one that underwent bris milah, which is part of the process of gerus. But Avraham was a ger in the other sense of the word. He cut himself off from the other nations of the world. So even according to the Brisker Rav, there was a certain status of gerus in regard to Avraham as well. So we could say, so why? So that's why we talk. That's why Yanai, who composed, Yanai lived at the time of Chasimas HaTalmud, and he's the one that composed the piyut of Vayihi B'Chatzi HaLeilos. Ger Tzedek in Sachta, he's the one that wrote that down. But that it doesn't go against what the Brisker Rav said. Brisker Rav only meant to say he doesn't have the status of a ger within Klal Yisrael, but he had the status of a ger, and it was an evolutionary process that began with Lachma. It was completed to a certain degree after Lot separated from him. But nevertheless, there's a lesson to be learned. Nevertheless, he goes out to fight to save Lot. So Ger Tzedek, and at that time, that was the maximum situation of a ger. A ger, it was at that time, that was before the bris milah, so he was not yet he did not yet serve as the foundation of Klal Yisrael, but he already separated himself. So he was considered a ger tzedek because there was no other concept of gerus at that point. So the holiday of Pesach is a holiday of gerus. Why? Because it's the holiday of Avraham Avinu, and that's what we say. Who does it have reference to? The Brisker Rav had a suffix. Does it have reference to Terech, or it has reference to Avraham? But and he seems to be inclined, and that's the simple reading. Avoseinu is Avraham Avinu. Avraham, he cares borrow. There's a machlokus whether he was at 3 years old or at 40 years old, and the Rishonim say it's not a real machlokus. At the age of 3, he began, but he completed it at the age of 40. The Rambam says 40 years old he was. So what we see, in a sense, and to a certain degree, that's a response to the question of the Ben Rusha. Because to the Ben Rusha, we really, as the Gra points out, we don't really answer the Ben Rusha. It's not that we don't want to communicate a message to him, but sometimes when we talk, sometimes silence and not answering a person, that's communication also. We're communicating a message, but we don't give up on the Ben Rusha. We see, even it's very interesting, we say, from the beginning, our ancestors were Oved Avodah Zarah. Why didn't it say Bitchila at the very beginning? But I think the Hagaddah here is telling us that throughout the generations, there was Ovdei Avodah Zarah. Throughout the generations, there were those who rejected the Masorah. But we don't have to give up. Because in our very foundation, made Chila, we saw what happened with Avraham Avinu. Avraham became a Makiris Boro. He's the one that was the foundation of Klal Yisrael. So even the Ben Russia, who we don't respond to, we don't give up on him. Avraham Avinu sets the precedent, and we can draw inspiration from Avraham Avinu. And that's, and it's very interesting. In the beginning of Parshas Vayera, so in the beginning of Parshas Vayera, the Torah tells us, Vayera v'alav Hashem, hu Yoshe Pesach Oel Kechom Hayom. And the Das Genim Mibala Tosfos says, Kechom Hayom, he says that was the time that people ate their meal. But Avram couldn't eat his meal unless he found a guest to invite. In a sense, the custom of Rav Huna of saying Kol Dichvin Yesei V'Yechol was really had its foundation in Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu couldn't eat his meal without looking for somebody to join him, for a traveler passing by. That's why, according to Das Kenim Baltosis, Avram was sitting outside Kechom Hayom. And this is why perhaps we can say that we emphasize Kol Dichvin Yeseh B'Yechol, because this is the holiday. Pesach is the holiday of Avraham Avinu, and Avram couldn't eat a meal without saying Kol Dichvin Yeseh B'Yechol, without standing outside his tent looking for a person to come. And the Chazal tell us that when was this done? This was Pesach time. It was on Pesach when the Malachim passed by. Avraham didn't know that they were Malachim. So Pesach is identified with Avraham. Pesach is identified with the midah of Avraham, with the trait of Avraham. What was the trait of Avraham? Chesed, hachnasus orchim. That was the trait of Avraham. So specifically when we start the Seder, so we say Kol Dichvin Yeseh B'Yechol. And now, and it's very interesting that I mentioned when you take a look at the Hagaddah. So when we look at the Parsha Bikurim, so at what point? First, the Parsha Bikurim says how difficult it was for the Jewish people in Egypt. But Vayanchu b'nei Yisrael min avoda, the Jewish people sighed from the avoda. Batal Shabbosim Elokim min avoda, their cries went out. Vayishma Hashem es kolenu, God heard our voices, the Hagaddah says. Shenema Vayishma Elokim es nakosam, God heard their cries. Vayiskor Elohim es briso, God remembered his covenant. Who was the covenant with? The covenant was with the Avos, but it began with Avraham Avinu. As Avram ves Yitzchak ves Yaakov, the Yaris and Yenu. So he then Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Of course, Hakadosh Baruch Hu always saw, but in a sense, sometimes it appears to us that Hakadosh Baruch Hu isn't looking. But when we cry out to him, that's when Hakadosh Baruch Hu answers our tefillas. And in whose chus does he answer our tefillas? In the chus of the Avos. I mentioned in the first brach of Shemona Esrei, Reb Chaim says that when the Ram says you need kavanah in the first brach of Shemona Esrei, it's kavanah, the intention for the Perish Hamilim, for the meaning of the words. Someone who can, of course. We're not talking about someone who can, but someone who has the ability to understand the words of Shemona Esrei. In the first bracha, he has to focus on the meaning of the words, with the idea being expressed. Doesn't have to be every word, but the idea being expressed in the Shemona Esrei. However, the rest of Shemona Esrei, he has to know that he's standing before God. So the question is, why is it that the first bracha of Shemona Esrei is different? And the answer is, we have a certain advantage. Of course, every person can daven. If I mentioned it before, ki beisi beis tefillah yikari l'chol ha'amim. The Beis Hamikdash is a house of prayer for all nations. Of course, it has to be not their prayers. Chas v'shalom. There's no economical services. There's no justification. It's certainly usher. Eliyahu Navi says, "In Mabal Elohim l'chu acharav." You can't combine the two. You have to choose. Worse than combining. There's nothing worse than combining the two. So the tefillah, but when we come as Jewish people, we come, and I mentioned the pshat. My father said, I saw it in my uncle's name also, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. So the simple explanation is the God that Avraham recognized, the God that Avraham felt subservient to. Elokei Yitzchak, the God that Yitzchak felt subservient to, that he recognized the God that Yaakov recognized. But there is another explanation also. Elokei Avraham means the God that belongs to Avraham, the God that belongs to Yitzchak, the God that belongs to Yaakov. What's the idea? The God that belongs to Avraham, the God that belongs to Yitzchak, belongs to Yaakov, because there's a bris avos, there's a covenant between the avos, which began with Avraham Avinu and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when there's a covenant, when there is a contract between the biggest company and the smallest worker, let it be the janitor, whoever it might be, to the degree of the contract, the worker has a lien on the company to a certain degree. To the extent of that lien, he owns the company. So when HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a contract, an oral contract, let it be, between Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, that started with Avram, it was to a certain degree, God belonged to Avram, belonged to Yitzchak, belonged to Yaakov. And it is when we daven, we invoke that contract. Consequently, there's a special need in the first bracha to understand the meaning of the first bracha, because the first bracha is Elokeinu, he's our God. When he's our God, it's not just that we recognize him as God. We could say, Elokeinu, the God belongs to us, and we explain Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, because he was the God of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the God that belonged to them. He's the God that belonged to them. And in a sense, to a certain degree, if we act properly, if we cry out to him, we invoke that contract By Yishmael Kemes Nakasenu, God heard our cries. By Yiskor Kemes Briso, God remembered his covenant. As Avraham as Yitzchak Yaakov, by Yaris and Yenu. So at this point, he, in a sense, figuratively saw our sad situation in Mitzrayim. And that's when the Gula begins. So in a sense, what is the holiday of Pesach? The holiday of Pesach is a holiday, it's a celebration of HaKadosh Baruch Hu listening to our prayers. And it's very interesting, the Rambam, when he discusses the holiday of Purim, it's interesting. One of the biggest problems I had always about Purim was the idea of Ad Lo Yoda. Strange, very strange. The simple explanation, I think, perhaps what sounds most correct to me, I can't say that all Rishonim have that explanation. Ad Lo Yoda doesn't mean that you should reach that state of being drunk. But Ad Lo Yoda means that until you reach that stage, there's a mitzvah of drinking. Once you reach that stage, there's no more mitzvah of drinking. Ad Lo Yoda is a tour. It's when you become exempt from the mitzvah. It's not a requirement. It's not a requirement to reach Ad Lo Yoda. But a person is, until he reaches Ad Lo Yoda, there's a mitzvah for him to drink. That would be the simple explanation to me. However, clearly from some of the Mefarshim, you don't appear that way. So the question is, why is it that Purim is Ad Lo Yoda? Now the Rambam in the Minyan HaMitzvos HaKotzer, which comes in the Yad HaChazaka immediately after his Hagdama to the Yad HaChazaka. So at the end over there, he talks about mitzvahs the Rabbanan. And he talks about he gives examples. One of them is Kriyas HaMegillah. And he says, what was the reason that the Nevi'im instituted Kriyas HaMegillah? To show the meaning Purim. It's a celebration of the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu answers the prayers of the Jews. So the question is, what? Again, that intensifies why Ad Lo Yoda. But I think the reason is because when the Gemara says, how do you know that you have to read the Megillah at night? How do you know? So the Gemara says, cites a pasuk in Tehillim. I cried out in the day and there was no answer. And at night, the Laila v'lo dumyanli. And I wasn't silent in the night either. So corresponding with our crying out, we read the Megillah both in the day and the night. Now, if you just read the Psukim, you get the impression that God didn't answer. God didn't answer the Jewish people. But we know the whole idea of the Megillah is that God did answer the Jewish people. So the idea is, I think, the Ad Lo Yoda is an extreme state of drunkenness. When one reaches Ad Lo Yoda, he cannot daven. It's not possible for him to daven. If there is a mitzvah of reaching the stage of Ad Lo Yoda, we are showing, as we are re-experiencing the miracle of Purim, we are showing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered our tefillas. There is no more a need to be mispalel for that nes, because the nes happened. HaKadosh Baruch Hu took care on that particular incident. Of course, we have to daven for other reasons. So it's, in a sense, now the Gemara talks about whether Purim should be an Adar Rishon or Adar Sheni, in the first Adar and the second Adar. And the Gemara says, "Kidei lismo gula legula," to to make the Gula of Purim close to the Gula of Pesach. Apparently, there is some connection. There is a similarity between the redemption of Purim and the redemption of Pesach. And I would suggest that the redemption of Purim, the redemption of Pesach, is one of HaKadosh Baruch, recognition of the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered our tefillos, and specifically in regard to Pesach, as a result of HaKadosh Baruch Hu answering our tefillos, the schus avos, and particularly the schus of Avraham Avinu, who was the first one to have a bris with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu acted on behalf of us and saved us. So this is the reason. So in a sense, it is the schus of the avos. It was the schus of the avos that came as a result of our tefillos. As a result of our tefillos, that Klal Yisrael was redeemed from Shibud Mitzrayim. And this should inspire us that as we look forward, as I started off, to the future Gula, that it should be b'mehera. It should be right away. And it's interesting to note, we want the Gula to be b'mehera, but who do we learn the halacha of zrizim makdimim lemitzvos? We learned that out from Avraham. So the midah of Avraham, and midah keneged midah, in the schus of Avraham's zrizim makdimim lemitzvos, of doing things quickly, immediately, that we should be zocha through our tefillas to see the geula shleima b'mehera, and it should happen very soon in our day. Okay.
If anyone has a question, please put it in the chat. Someone just wanted a little bit quick clarification about the Gemara Megillah, about Purim is in the second Adar, so the Geulas are next to each other.
Yeah, so the Gemara says that, in other words, the Chachamim wanted that Pesach should be close, that Purim should be close to Pesach. Apparently, there's a common denominator, and one sheds light on the other. Understand?
Yeah.
Purim, the Rambam says, is thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for listening to our prayers, of crying out to him. So, and Pesach, I think, is the same thing to a certain degree, because when you take a look at the Parsha Bikurim, where does everything change? By Yishma Hashem es Kolenu, by Yanchu b'nei Yisrael manavoda, the Yizoku, they cried out, the Taz Shabbos Malakim. I know there are some Rishonim that explain that it wasn't necessarily a form of tefillah, but many explained that it was a form of tefillah. But Tal Shabbos Malakim min havoda, by Yishma Hashem es Kolenu. God heard our voices. It wasn't just the cries. It was our voices that identified with tefillah. Kamoshenemar, by Yishmael Kimes Nakosam, by Yisrael Kimes Briso, Sabram Yitzchak Yaakov. So, in other words, our tefillos, in a sense, brought about the HaKadosh Baruch Hu invoking or using the bris avos to redeem the Jewish people.
Okay. Is there a correlation between Megillah not having Hashem's name and the Hagaddah not having Moshe's name?
There are many reasons given why Hashem's name is not mentioned in the Megillah. Some say because the Nisim were b'derech hateva, and this was just the opposite. So if you want to make a correlation, so you could say because God wasn't necessarily apparent Megillah. In other words, of course, it was obvious for a person who would think, but a person always had the ability to deny God's presence at Purim. Masha'en came by Yetzias Mitzrayim, where there was clearly miracles that went against the Derech HaTeva. So there, God's presence was apparent there. So God's presence is apparent. So to a certain degree, Moshe's role is not, doesn't play that same major role in terms of what we see. So perhaps if a person wants to draw an analogy, I'm not sure that I would, but if a person wants to draw an analogy, they could draw that analogy. And for future generations that didn't see it, so there is a fear that people will think that Moshe is the one who did it. So because of that, we have to emphasize that it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then to a certain degree, we could say that's part of Chayav Adam Liros Asatzmo. We have to make it very, very, we have to put ourselves in that situation. We have to put ourselves in that situation. And to the Jews of that situation, it wasn't Moshe. There was no way to see that it was Moshe. It was only HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Okay,
so that could be part of Chayav Adam Liros Asatzmo.
Someone asked, and this could be a whole share in itself, but is it possible to review the difference in thanks and praise, which you mentioned at the beginning?
Yes, there clearly is a difference between thanks and praise. My feeling is the first half of the Hagaddah is thanks to God. The second half of the Hagaddah after the meal is mainly praise. Both is both, but the focus of the first half of the Hagaddah is thanks, and the second half we see that from the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon says that the reason you have to finish the second half of Hallel by Chatzos, by midnight, according to that opinion, is because of the 4 kosos, for the 4 cups of wine. So the question is, why did he have to say because of the 4 cups of wine? Maybe it's because of the Hallel itself. You understand? Maybe it's because of the Hallel itself. And you can't say because the Hallel itself is the Rabbanan, because the 4 cups of wine is also the Rabbanan. It's also rabbinic. Tosfos says because it's the Rabbanan. But the 4 cups of wine is rabbinic. And the reason you have to finish the Hagaddah before Chatzos is the Vilna Gaon says it's not because of the Hallel, it's because of the last cup of wine that's said after the Hallel. So in other words, in regard to the second half of the Hagaddah, the second half of Hallel could be, according to the Vilna Gaon, there isn't a requirement of Chayav Adam Liros Asatzmo Kiliyatzim Mitzrayim. Isn't a requirement of a sense of seeing ourselves at the time of the Exodus. But when we drink the Dalet Kosos, when we drink all 4 cups, as the Rambam says, that's part of the mitzvah of Chayav Adam, of seeing us, of re-experiencing the freedom that the Jewish people attained at that time. Those things that are re-experiencing have to be, according to the sheet of Rabbi Lezer, they have to be before Chatzos, before midnight. Those things that are not part of the re-experiencing, that's after midnight. In a sense, we go back and forth in time. During the meal, we go to the present. But then when we drink the Dalet Kosos, when we drink the 4 cups, we're going back to the past. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here. And there might be a share. Obviously, next Sunday, there's no share because next Sunday is Yantef here in Chutz La'aretz. There may be a share a week from Tuesday at around 5:30 Chicago time for the yahrzeit of the rabbi's uncle, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveichik. So check your emails and the way you normally find out about share, if there will be a special share on Tuesday afternoon of Chol Hamoed. Everyone have a good week, and we'll see you soon.